Hello, this is Elizabeth Chu, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to From the Vault, the South Carolina Historical Society podcast, created and hosted by my colleague Sydney Derrick, our librarian. This podcast will demystify archives. I am passionate about convincing people that archives are not in any way boring. They are, in fact, incredibly interesting. Who doesn't like to read stories about other people? Imagine spending all day long in a library reading someone else's diary. That is what historians and people who use archives do every day. From the Vault, we'll be telling stories of all South Carolinians from the perspective of the many fascinating items in our large and important archival collections.
Hello and welcome to our podcast, From the Vault. As you just heard from Elizabeth there, I am Sydney Derrick, librarian here at the South Carolina Historical Society. Just a few days have passed in our order book since the South Carolinians achieved an unexpected victory over the British at the Battle of Sullivan's Island in 1776. And the United States of America has now officially declared their independence from the King and Great Britain, which we'll talk about how that was seen locally a little bit later in the order book. For now, it's back to normal here in Charleston as the troops continue to ready themselves to be able to protect their city and their new nation. However, we called this episode Bad Behavior in the Ranks because there are a lot of transgressions and disciplinary action in the entries that we're going to talk about today. Maybe it was the influx of new troops. Maybe the soldiers felt with the Battle of Sullivan's Island won, they could relax, but some rules are being broken and the order book talks about it. But before we get to all that, let's hear some announcements. In just a few days, we're hosting our 170th annual meeting. We invite you to join us on Thursday, March 13th at 5:30 at South Carolina Society Hall here in Charleston to enjoy cocktails, hors d'oeuvres, celebrate our successes, and learn about upcoming projects. The next evening, March 14th, we're hosting an event at our own Fireproof building to honor the 200th anniversary of the Marquis de Lafayette's American tour. The Revolutionary War hero visited Charleston on his tour in March of 1825, and our event will feature a piano made specially for Lafayette's tour. 2 pianists will play period-specific music on the piano throughout the event, and drinks and light snacks will be available. You can find more information about these and all of our events at the News and Events tab on our website, schistory.org. Our digitization project for the Henry Lawrence papers is rolling along, and some of those papers are now available to view on the Lowcountry Digital Library. Lawrence was a founding father of our country and our state, and his papers were one of the first collections acquired by the South Carolina Historical Society when we formed in 1855. Once you get onto the Lowcountry Digital Library's website, search for Henry Lawrence to view these documents that shaped our nation. Before we dive into the order book, let's talk about our sources. For this episode, in addition to the 4th Regiment's order book, we used minutes of the Provincial Congress of North Carolina, April 4th, 1776 through May 14th, 1776, accessed through Documenting the American South, the Charles Lee Papers, published by the New York Historical Society, a book titled William Temple Cole's Family from Ireland to North Carolina and Beyond by William C. Coles, Jr. et al., the letters of George Washington found on the website Founders Online, hosted by the National Archives, the Charleston Time Machine podcast by Dr. Nick Butler for the Charleston County Public Library, and the Journal of William Tennant, held by the South Caroliniana Library at the University of South Carolina. So General Charles Lee actually floated that theory that I mentioned earlier, that the soldiers had gotten a little lazy on the heels of their victory in the Battle of Sullivan's Island. He wrote to South Carolina President John Rutledge saying as much in July of 1776 and asked Rutledge to help him urge the men that the city still needed protection and structures built and maintained to aid in that protection. So let's see what they're up to. General Orders 11th July, parole Mott, countersign Woodford. The commanding officer of every corps to make a strict examination of the men's arms and to make a report of such as want repair. His Excellency John Rutledge, Esquire, President of South Carolina, having appointed John Creighton, Esquire, to act and do the duty of Town Major for Charlestown, he is to be respected and obeyed as such. No white man is to leave town without a pass from the officer on command at the main guard. He is to grant it on a license from the officer to whose corps the person applying for it belongs, and not otherwise, except as aforementioned. Such licenses and passes are not to be granted as a course, but upon good grounds only, and the officers granting the licenses are to specify therein when the persons obtaining them are to return, and take care that they do so at the proper times. Where persons who apply for passes are not of any particular corps, and there are good reasons to give them leave of absence, the officer on command at the main guard is to grant them. Signed, John Rutledge. Regimental Orders. For guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Beckman. This evening of Captain White's company, 8 men and 1 corporal to be warned to hold themselves in readiness to join the detachment at Hadrell's Point tomorrow morning. The quartermaster to take care to have a proper boat and hands ready at Gadsden's Wharf tomorrow by 7 o'clock to take the detachment over to Hadrell's. General Order 12 July, parole Lawrence, countersign Vigor. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Yuji. Field Officer of the Guard, Colonel McIntosh. The field officers and town majors' rounds are to visit all guards of the artillery and others round the town. No gun to be fired in town without first obtaining leave from the field officer of the day. 15 July, parole Sterling, countersign Sawbridge. For independent companies of town militia acting as artillery to send regularly an adjutant or other officer acting as adjutant to the adjutant general to receive the orders of the day. The town major for the future is to give them at or before sunset the parole and countersign. If he should be indisposed, he must send it sealed. The town major is likewise to give the parole and countersign to the other guards. The officer of the main guard is not to consider this regulation as superseding the order of the 14th June directing him to send the parole and countersign to the different guards. He is to continue the custom. This sort of duplicate is necessary to prevent miscarriages or mistakes. The officers commanding the different guards are to give the parole to the grand rounds after they have received the countersign. To the other rounds, they are not to give the parole, but to receive the countersign and parole from them. We've talked about this several times before, but this goes into a lot of detail about how the parole and countersign words are used. And again, they were basically passwords to get in and out of the protected areas where the military were, the forts or the barracks or the encampments, anything like that, so that they knew who was coming in and out was a patriot, was a member of the American forces or someone that was connected to them. General Orders 17 July, parole Bullet, countersign Page. Regimental Orders. For guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Beckman. As several men have lately deserted the regiment, which they could not have done but by the neglect or connivance of the sentinels, it is expected the officer of the guard will strictly charge all his sentries not to suffer any private of the regiment to pass from the barracks after dark without a line from an officer for that purpose. Any soldier who shall be convicted of having violated this order may depend on receiving the severest punishment. The quartermaster, or in his absence, his sergeant, must deliver daily to the different companies the quantities of provisions they may be entitled to, agreeable to their respective returns, and a sergeant of each company must be appointed to receive the same and distribute it into the proper number of messes. Desertion was a very real problem in all areas of the newly formed America. In early 1777, so just about 6 months after where we are in the order book, George Washington issues a circular to 11 of the 13 states. So a circular is kind of like a bulletin or a memo, but it sort of goes out as a newsletter to many, many people. And South Carolina was one of the 2 states that did not get it. Georgia was the other. But the circular asked that the state governments pass stricter laws for those who harbored or helped deserters, specifically saying that many people were helping soldiers when they deserted and returned home to their own towns. The townspeople there were helping them, or at least not reporting them, according to Washington. He wrote, quote, "Desertion must cease, of course, when the deserters find they have no shelter." Now, There were many reasons that soldiers left the Army. Some were needed on their farms back at home. Some did not want to endure the brutal conditions that soldiers at the time were put through. The Army had an issue with keeping their troops fed and properly clothed. So that doesn't help people want to stick around. And there were some soldiers that also became members of multiple regiments in order to collect money offered for service, only to then desert and join another regiment to collect money there. And Washington actually writes about this practice in some of his letters. All right, let's get back to the order book. General Orders, 18 July, Parole Burke, countersign Constitution. Notwithstanding general orders, the aide-de-camps are frequently stopped by the sentinels, the officer of the different guards, to be answerable that this does not happen again. The aide-de-camps are known by their green ribbon. The court-martial of which Colonel Sumner was president is approved of and dissolved. Burrell's Lawn, sentenced to receive 39 lashes, is pardoned by the general, the prisoner to be immediately released from confinement. A garrison court-martial to sit tomorrow for the trial of Captain William Temple Cole of Colonel Polk's regiment, prosecuted by the general for ungentlemanly and scandalous conduct. William Temple Cole, who I also saw his last name written as Coles with an S, but he's serving as a captain of a company in the 4th Regiment of North Carolina at this time under Colonel Thomas Polk. While the order book never specifies what he's charged with, we'll hear some more about his trial over the next few entries here. I did find mention of this court-martial in the letters of General Charles Lee, who was overseeing things in Charleston at this point, but he doesn't specify the charges either. He does write to Cole on this day, July 18th, explaining that it's his duty as general to bring the court-martial because, quote, "It is not only a duty I owe to the service and the station I am in, but also to the character of the officers in general to bring this affair, in which you were accused of being the principal actor, to a trial immediately," end quote. Now, he also explains that he can't let Cole appear in public before the trial is over. It's possible that Cole was charged with challenging a superior officer, but I just haven't been able to find any evidence. As a side note here, reading General Lee's letters was enlightening. He seems to have some pettiness in him. We've talked in past episodes about the fact that Lee did not think that the fort on Sullivan's Island would hold in a battle and told Colonel Moultrie, who built the fort, how terrible it was. In a June 29th letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, he was still talking about that, even after it survived the Battle of Sullivan's Island victoriously. Lee wrote, quote, "They attacked with 8 ships of war a very imperfect and ill-planned fort on Sullivan's Island, and they were fairly repulsed. I really believe with very great loss," end quote. So even though he's talking about how the battle went well, he's really insulting the fort there. However, he does concede to George Washington on July 1st, just a few days later, that, quote, "Our works were so good and solid that we lost but few," end quote. And it's interesting that the fort that was so maligned by General Lee was really the basis of our state flag and our state tree, those palmetto logs. He didn't think would hold up, and they very much did. 20th July, General Orders. That a court-martial be held on Wednesday next at the barracks on Gadsden's Wharf for the trial of John Davis of the Artillery Regiment for desertion. That the 1st, 2nd, and 4th Regiment do each furnish 2 captains and 2 subalterns to be members of said court. That Major Elliott set as president of the same. Lieutenant Charles Lining as judge advocate. That Captain Mott of the 2nd Regiment, Lieutenants Detreville and Gilbank of the 4th be summoned as evidences, and that all other witnesses do attend the same. Captains Beckman and White, with Lieutenants Grimke and Villapanto, are to be members of the General Court-Martial from the 4th Regiment. Evidences must be punctual in their attendance. General Order, Parole, Honor, countersign, Elliott. The charge brought against Cole of Colonel Polk's regiment is of so extraordinary a nature, and the character of the gentleman accused is in general so good, that General Lee thinks it his duty, previous to a formal trial, that a court of inquiry should examine the affair. Colonel Huger, therefore, and the gentlemen summoned as a court-martial are desired to consider themselves as a court of inquiry. Court of inquiry is not sworn, but only collects evidences and gives an opinion whether the matter inquired into is or is not, of so serious a nature as to render the court-martial necessary. General Orders, 21st July, 1776. Parole, Port Royal. Countersign, Baltimore. The Court of Inquiry, which Colonel Huger was president to examine into the conduct of Captain Cole of the 4th Battalion of North Carolinians, are of opinion that he is not guilty of the charge brought against him. He is therefore ordered out of arrest. So William Temple Cole was officially sent back to his regiment, free of all charges. He would go on to fight in 2 major battles in Pennsylvania, as well as the fighting at Stono Ferry here in South Carolina in 1779. He also spent time at Valley Forge with General George Washington. And after the war, he went back to North Carolina and was granted land there. He had gotten married during the war and did have at least one son. It's around this time that General Charles Lee is writing to people saying that the British ships are leaving Charleston Harbor. They've gotten back over the sandbars that were difficult to cross, and they're heading back out to sea. The British ended up suffering a good many casualties and injuries in the Battle of Sullivan's Island, including injuries to Sir Peter Parker, who was leading the fleet at the battle, and to Lord William Campbell. We've talked about him in past episodes because he was the last royal governor of South Carolina and was run out of the state a short time after taking office because of his allegiance to the crown. While he did initially survive his injuries in the battle, he would die about 2 years later because of them. And in just a couple weeks from now, George Washington writes to John Hancock about reports from British deserters who had been on one of the ships at the Battle of Sullivan's Island. They tell the American general that the convoy that they were a part of landed recently on Staten Island in New York and were preparing for an attack in that area. General Order, 22 July. Parole Roberts. Countersign, Safety. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Polk. Field Officer of the Guard, Major Ford. Regimental Orders. For Guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Grimke. The artillery guard to be relieved every morning at 7 o'clock until further orders. John Davis must be informed by the adjutant that his trial will be on Wednesday next, that he may be prepared for the same. 24 July, Regimental Orders. For Guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Detreville. The adjutant, or in his absence, the officer of the guard, must attend the general court-martial to execute any order of the courts relative to the prisoners or evidences. General Orders. Parole Ballack. Countersign, Defense. The officer commanding the guard over the prisoners lately taken is to consider it as a standing order not to suffer any person without the president's or general's permission to enter the place of their confinement or hold intercourse with them of any kind. The least breach of the order will be esteemed a very serious transgression. So once again, the soldiers are doing something wrong. Some of the prison guards are apparently allowing prisoners there, whether captured members of the British or Loyalist forces or American soldiers who are accused of wrongdoing, to have visitors. And the higher-ups are threatening some punishment for the guards if this continues. 25 July, General Order, Parole Huger, Countersign Roberts. No vice can be so destructive at all times to an army as gaming. It wins fortunes, corrupts morals, relaxes discipline, and creates deadly feuds and animosities amongst men who ought to be united as one band of brothers. But at this solemn crisis, when the lives, properties, and liberties not only of the present generation, but of all American posterity are at stake, it is more particularly indecent and odious. It is besides a most outrageous violation of the laws of Congress. In short, in our present circumstances, it is ungentlemanlike, dishonest, wicked, and impious. With astonishment and horror, therefore, the general has learned that several officers, both continental and militia, daily are guilty of this abominable vice, and in consequence of this information, he thinks it his duty publicly to apprise the whole army that he will prosecute to the utmost rigor of the law those who trespass in this article, let their rank be what it will. Regimental Orders. Lieutenant Gilbank, Hugh Laurie, Patrick McGee, and Richard Lewis to attend the general court-martial as evidences. The adjutant to summon the paymaster to prove John Clark's having received pay in the regiment. Lieutenant Detreville to prove his desertion. The gaming that they're talking about here is gambling. According to an article on Colonial Williamsburg's website, card games like whist and cribbage were popular at this time, as was dice and placing wagers on activities like wrestling and target shooting. In 1776, George Washington issued general orders that forbid gambling, saying, quote, "All officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers are positively forbid playing at cards and other games of chance. At this time of public distress, men may find enough to do in the service of their God and their country without abandoning themselves to vice and immorality," end quote. So it's very similar tone and invoking of morality to that order book entry there. Very eloquently written, I might add. General Order 26 July, Parole Middleton, countersign Linac. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Yuji. Field Officer of the Guard, Major Yuji. Seines are to be provided for the use of the Continental troops. One is already provided. Colonel Hinnon must take it into his care. Each regiment is to appoint a certain number of men to fish for them. This is to be considered as a duty. A quick note here that a seine is a type of net used in fishing. It's really big, and you kind of have two men on either side of it, and you drag it along through the water and then up on the shore to catch the fish. So this may have been a solution to that problem of feeding troops. I mean, we're right here on the coast. Let's use what we got. The general hopes that a quantity of whiskey and peach brandy will be brought to town, which may be afforded at a reasonable price. He can assure the officers and soldiers that he shall, in all things, study their care and comfort. His Excellency the President and Council are now devising the means of reducing the exorbitant prices of all the necessaries of life. The General Court-Martial held at Hadrill's Point, of which Colonel Muhlenberg was president, is approved and dissolved. Duncan Fletcher of the 1st Regiment of North Carolinians is sentenced to death for attempting to desert to the enemy. Monday is appointed for the day of execution. He is immediately to be appraised of his sentence that he may prepare himself for this awful event. John Brown of the same regiment adjudged to receive 39 lashes for sleeping on his post, to receive the punishment adjudged tomorrow morning at guard mounting. Regimental Order 27th July. For guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Davis. General Orders, Parole Virginia, countersign Heasy. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Pinckney. Field Officer of the Guard, Major Ford. The Quartermaster General to provide vessels to transport tomorrow morning to Sullivan's Island the fascines and gabions now laying under the care of Major Elliott on or near Gadsden's Wharf. A subaltern and 20 men to be warned for this duty, which is to be considered a duty of fatigue. The subaltern to take down in writing the number of fascines and gabions he receives from Major Elliott and give a receipt for them. He is then to put them on board the vessel prepared by the Quartermaster General for this purpose, and to proceed to Sullivan's Island, where he is to deliver them to the care of the officer appointed by Major Marion or commanding officer of the fort to take charge of them, who is to give a receipt for the number delivered. The Continental and Provincial troops to parade on Monday morning at sunrise, as the General wishes to give the officers some idea of the method he proposed to Congress and was approved for the arrangement of the battalions. A subaltern and 20 men from Colonel Yuji's regiment to execute the orders given by the General for receiving and transporting the fascines and gabions. We've talked about these before, so just a quick reminder. Gabions were woven basket-like structures filled with stones and dirt, and fascines were bundles of sticks that tied together. These two items would have been used to construct trenches that would protect soldiers when they were fighting battles. So they're taking a bunch of these over to Sullivan's Island. General Order, 29th July, 1776. All officers commanding batteries in or about Charlestown are to make returns of the number and nature of their ordnance, with the quantity of their ammunition for each gun at their respective batteries as soon as possible to Colonel Roberts of the Artillery. Signed, Charles Lee. 30th July, General Orders, Parole Purrysburg, countersign Edwards. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Major Ford. A subaltern and 15 men of the Light Horse to march to Port Royal to gain what intelligence they are able concerning the enemy's fleet and to return with the report. As the weather is extremely hot, it is recommended to them to march gently. When they return, they are to bring back under their escort the 4 wagons which belonged to Muhlenberg's regiment and were lent to the militia. As it is intended that Thompson's and Sumter's regiments shall soon be detached on a service which may separate them from the general for some time, he takes this opportunity to return his warmest thanks to the colonels, to the officers, and to the men for their zeal, alacrity, and spirit which they have displayed on all occasions, and to assure them that he shall, with pleasure, avail himself of every opportunity to render them any service. 30 July, Regimental Orders. For guard tomorrow, Lieutenant Roberts. A subaltern, 1 sergeant, 1 corporal, and 21 privates to mount a guard at the old barracks to take charge of the magazines and hospital there. General Orders. Parole, Georgia. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Pinckney. A court-martial of the line to be summoned tomorrow morning. Captain James Jones of the Light Horse prosecuted by General Lee for holding language tending to mutiny. After orders. The court-martial of which Colonel Nash was president for the trial of Captain Jones of the Light Horse of North Carolina is approved of and dissolved. The court being of the opinion that he is not guilty of the charges brought against him, he is therefore ordered out of arrest. The whole garrison, except such as are upon duty, to be out tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock on the common behind the hornwork for the execution of Duncan Fletcher, condemned to die for desertion. And the next day's entry is free of anything mentioning Duncan Fletcher. It's really short, and it just lists the field officer and officer of the magazine guard for the next day. And then the order book rolls on to August. The hornwork that they mention there would have been near today's Marion Square. So if the execution of Duncan Fletcher happened, that's the general area where it would have happened. General Orders. 1st August. The 1st Regiment of Provincials is to relieve the 2nd at Sullivan's Island. The Artillery Regiment is to go to Fort Johnson, and the 2nd Regiment is to come up to town forthwith. The colonels will settle with each other the times of moving so as to make it convenient as may be to themselves and the regiments. Signed, John Rutledge. Regimental Orders. Officer of the Day tomorrow, Lieutenant Beckman. For Magazine Guard, Lieutenant Detreville. The commanding officer, observing an unaccountable remissness in the officers in matters of duty and violating the standing orders of the regiment, thinks it necessary to remind them that the hour of roll calling is 5 o'clock in the morning, and that he expects all officers off of duty will punctually attend the same. Should any of them hereafter think proper to neglect it, they may be assured it will be well esteemed as willful breach of orders and expect to be treated accordingly. General Orders for August. Parole, Poland. Countersign, Warsaw. Field Officer of the Day tomorrow, Colonel Parsons. The whole troops, continental and provincial, that are off of duty are to parade tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock near Liberty Tree, where they are to hear the Declaration of Independence read and a sermon preached on the occasion by Dr. Piercy. Regimental Orders. The officers and men of Captain White's company are to hold themselves in readiness to embark for Johnson's Fort at the shortest notice. Major Elliott to take command of this detachment. After orders. A sergeant and 12 matrosses with the brass 6-pounder and 50 rounds of ammunition to be ready to join a detachment of Colonel Moultrie's regiment tomorrow morning at Rags Wharf, from which they will embark. The quartermaster to supply them with 4 days' provisions. Lieutenant Roberts to command this party. So the next day, August 5th, 1776, the people of Charleston heard the Declaration of Independence read for the very first time. Dr. Nick Butler, who hosts the Charleston Time Machine podcast for the Charleston County Public Library, has a fantastic 2-part episode on the Liberty Tree where the document was read, so definitely go listen to that. But just to give a little background, Dr. Butler says in that episode that the tree was in today's Ansonboro neighborhood of downtown Charleston in what was then called Gadsden's Green, after Christopher Gadsden. The tree is not there anymore, but there is a historic marker for it, and that's on Alexander Street, near where it meets Calhoun Street. The first time the tree was used as a gathering place was in 1766, after the repeal of the Stamp Act. 26 men, including Christopher Gadsden, met there to talk politics and have some snacks. For the reading of the Declaration of Independence, the troops paraded to the tree, and the declaration was read by the leader of the 4th Regiment, Barnard Elliott. And this was actually the third reading in Charleston that day. The first was at the State House at Meeting in Broad Streets. And then there was a reading at the Exchange Building at the end of Broad Street. And finally, the Liberty Tree reading was at 3 p.m. that day. It was published to the soldiers at Fort Johnson and Sullivan's Island the next day, August 6th. The University of South Carolina's South Carolinian Library holds several journals of William Tennant, who was a Presbyterian minister serving at the Congregational Church in Charleston. He was originally from the North and moved down here, but he traveled the backcountry of our state with important men of the time, like William Henry Drayton, and he was also involved in politics. And in his diary, he recorded the events of this day in Charleston and wrote, quote, "No event has seemed to diffuse more general satisfaction among the people. This seems to be designed as a most important epoch in the history of South Carolina, and from this day, it is no longer to be considered as a colony, but as a state." End quote. And that's where we're going to leave it for this episode, on this monumental occasion where the people of South Carolina, the everyday people going about their business, just like you and me, were witness to history. We'll be back with a new episode on the second Monday in March. And until then, you can listen to all of our old episodes wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Instagram or Facebook, or check out our website, schistory.org. We'll see you next month.